Genocide Convention. They are never, they're constantly, should I say, repeating their commitments to international law, but they have done absolutely nothing to comply with those obligations in terms of imposing sanctions on Israel. So we hope that they will finally do something that will be meaningful in terms of sanctioning the state of Israel, and they have a chance with this bill.
Thanks a lot. I'll speak and then I'll run back to my committee, unfortunately. First thing I want to do is to draw attention to a government plan to effectively, in all but words, do away with social housing. We've seen a glimpse of this in councils right across the country, including Dublin City, hiking up rents by 30% for council tenants in the area I represent, which is covered by South Dublin County Council. The council are planning to implement this for next year. But a report is now coming out from the government. It doesn't appear to be published on their website yet, but it's been distributed to some councillors, which makes clear that this is part of a wholesale assault on the right to access social housing, and will involve massive increase of council rents right across the country. This, in effect, is signalled already in the government's programme for government, which talks about merging over time social housing and cost rental housing, which would mean a tripling, quadrupling of the rents that tenants pay. Tenants in Dublin City, in South Dublin, across the country, are really getting organised to fight against these increases. And in doing so, they're not just fighting for themselves. They're fighting on the housing crisis as a whole. Because a core reason that we have the housing crisis today in the state that we're in was the previous collapse of social housing and the undermining of social housing by the government. And the basic principle of differential rent, whereby you pay a percentage of what you earn, is a fair principle. It's a sort of socialist principle, and it's a principle that the government wants to get rid of. We think, and we've been pushing for a long time, we need to go in the opposite direction. We need to increase the limits of thresholds for access to social housing, and ultimately we need to get rid of those limits altogether. We need universal access to social housing, which would therefore mean that the councils are actually generating increased rent, because a percentage income of higher incomes will mean that the council is getting increased rent. And obviously this is happening at a time that we're seeing in terms of Oliver Bond, in terms of other flat complexes across the city, which have been left in a horrific state in the course of my canvassing in Dublin Central. Obviously I've seen many of these quite horrific instances in terms of just horrendous amounts of mould, of rats and so on, homes that are unsuitable for people to be living in 2026. And now the government is effectively signalling to many of these people that they are being abandoned. So on the one hand, they're preparing, have implemented and are preparing for further increases in rents and not behaving like a decent landlord at all. Secondly, and quickly, just in relation to the by-election in Dublin Central, obviously we really welcome the fact that Eoin O'Connor is now being included in the RTE radio debate on Friday morning. Make sure to listen, Dave McCullough. There'll be box office stuff. And we want to thank all those who supported our campaign for Eoin's voice to be heard on RTE. One of the things presumably that will come up is the issue that emerged yesterday because of the Ditches reporting about the Lord Mayor, Ray McAdam, who's running for Fine Gael, abusing public resources in contravention of the ethics for councillors by using the mayor's car to go to an election event where he was participating effectively in a hustings. Eoin was there, he was not there. Ray McAdam was not there at all in his capacity as Lord Mayor. He was clearly there in his capacity as a candidate for the by-election, and the rules are very clear in terms of what the use of that car is for. So Eoin has made a complaint to the ethics registrar in Dublin City Council, and we're calling for a formal investigation by the council into what appears to be a very blatant breach of the ethical rules for councillors.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be heading off to support the ambulance workers after this event, and I just want to say a couple of things. I just heard the Taoiseach on the radio calling on all parties to get together. Let's be very clear here. The government is the employer here, right? I know it's been the practice to outsource everything, to third parties like the HSE, the NTA, etc., the NCSE. But the government is who makes the decisions here, and they have decided that frontline health workers are not important enough to be paid properly, and they've also decided that education isn't important enough to fund it properly either, such that we take money from other departments. So last night I held a meeting on additional needs, SNAs, and we had parents again with heartbreaking stories, a mother whose son has not been to school for 2 years. And parents did raise, and SNAs raised at that meeting, the idea that it's been put out there into the public that it's people with additional needs who are taking now from the rest of society. And they are really wanted to strongly object to that. So I think it's very linked with the paramedics, with the ambulance workers, and the way that essential services are not valued by this government. And Jack Chambers playing the Thatcherite right now won't go down very well, particularly in cost of living crisis. I also want to mention the Ireland-Israel game. I think it's very noteworthy that this weekend there will not be Eurovision broadcast in Ireland, and 5 states are now boycotting the Eurovision. So it shows it can be done, and it really reinforces the call for Ireland not to play the games, and I mean games plural, because it isn't just about playing here in Ireland, it's about boycotting and having nothing to do with a team that's soaked in apartheid, racism and genocide, very linked with the IDF. And the idea that we'll have 3,000 seats reserved for Israeli supporters as well. I mean, what I'm glad to see is that momentum is hugely building behind, Stop the Game. A campaign has been launched. Many players have now signed up, and many individuals. And I think it's yet again another sign of the government being completely out of touch. Solidarity members have been, leafleting some games, but also we're going to be holding public meetings in areas, working with our local solidarity groups to make sure that we stop this game. And I actually think that it's very likely that it could be stopped. I just also want to mention, finally, the issue of racism in the by-election campaigns. I think it's really worrying that statements, particularly about interning people, so-called illegal immigrants in this country. First of all, you're not illegal, as it is not illegal to seek refuge in a country. But obviously that's something that's being put out. But those were carefully made remarks because there's a cohort of people who will respond to racist comments. And I'm glad those comments have been condemned, but we have to call out an article in the Irish Times over the weekend by Mark O'Connell about why Mary Lou MacDonald, as leader of Sinn Féin, would not condemn those absolutely brutal remarks. I just want to say the idea that we don't comment on other people's comments. Of course we comment on other people's comments, and particularly in a by-election, if somebody's stirring up using hatred. We have minorities in this country living in fear. Many of them live in Dublin Central too, by the way. And we should call it out. There's no room for pussyfooting with racism and saying, oh, I'll be careful, I'll equivocate. Racism and racist comments have to be condemned. And Sinn Féin or anybody else thinking that they can sit on the fence on that issue is completely wrong. And it's a very tiny cohort of people that will respond to that anyway. And I think it should be called out.
Would you say then that people before profit voters in Dublin Central should be transferred to Sinn Féin as a result of that kind of positioning by Sinn Féin?
I'm not a member of People for Profit, I'm a member of Solidarity, so the candidates, I let them speak for that. But the thing is, racism is too important an issue nationally and internationally in this country now for any sort of equivocation. And I know every single party should be calling out racism and condemning it, and obviously left parties as well.
Richard, to return to the issue of stricter controls of government spending, as I recall, the extra money the government brought in to resolve the SNA dispute earlier this year was 19 million, which is a small fraction of the 600 million overspend in the Department of Education. Is it fair to suggest that Jack Chambers is pitting government departments against children with special needs, given that ratio?
Well, I think it is clear on health previously and now on education that there's a sort of, first of all, there's a deliberate underfunding of key frontline services in health and education. And then we have sort of overruns which suggest the real spending requirements or funding requirements for those key services. And we have this narrative then about overruns and the need to kind of curb the spending. And I think that's a sort of game which the government are playing in order to justify not putting the necessary funding into those areas. And special needs has sort of highlighted that, and it was the government who kind of made that equation following the recent crisis, where the government were hammered over their attempt to implement swinging cuts for huge numbers of schools and school communities of SNAs. It was the government who said on the back of that, we have to allocate extra money, and therefore that's going to have implications for spending in other departments. So they've made the equation, and we're calling it out, because providing the necessary funding for education in general, or special needs in particular, does not require necessarily cutting anybody else. There is an alternative, and that are additional taxes on the profits of corporations that have quadrupled, or on the wealth of the multimillionaires in this country, which has increased dramatically in recent years.
Can I say, because I'm on the Education Committee, so there was a discussion around that issue, and it wasn't clear what the 640 million was for. You're right, it isn't all going to special needs at all. And the Minister came in, and we have to bring her in again. It's still not, there isn't a breakdown of exactly where it's going. Some of it is wages, salaries, which is obviously a lot of any budget. But still, the message is kind of filtering out there and being taken up to mean that it is for additional needs, because certainly that was what people felt at that meeting last night in the Blanchardstown area.
And both of you might offer a comment on this. Is it time for Keir Starmer to resign as leader of the Labour Party?
Yeah, absolutely. Keir Starmer should go. There are many reasons he should go. His social welfare cuts, but also his atrocious failure to impose sanctions or to do anything in relation to Israel's genocide against the Palestinians, and in fact his apologetics for Israel's genocidal behaviour against the Palestinians. For that reason alone, in my opinion, he should go. But it's obviously his failures have also given fuel to the far right in Britain, which he bears a lot of responsibility for doing that. That a Labour government that won such a huge victory only a very short time ago could be so discredited that we now could be looking at a sort of far right government headed by somebody as horrible as Nigel Farage. That has to be laid at Keir Starmer's doorstep, that failure. So I think he should get out of the way. And not that I would have any great confidence in who else in the Labour Party is going to take up the mantle, but certainly Starmer has failed and he should go.
Do you have any comments to make on the events yesterday in Strandheim, where the UM5 were up again for another hearing?
Sorry?
The UM5.
Another hearing yesterday in Strandheim.
Yeah, I think it's an absolute travesty what's happening with the UM5. And we have asked for the Irish government to send observers, and we haven't had any response. The family have asked. I've conveyed that request to the government on several occasions in the Dáil. But they are being treated, and judges are making comments. The judge is making comments to the effect as if these people are a danger to somebody, when they're a danger to nobody. I mean, their protest was an act of civil disobedience, but there was no threats of violence, not even a suggestion of violence in what they did. In fact, they were trying to stop the violence of giving weapons to Israel to commit genocidal crimes for which Israel is in the dock in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. That's what they were doing. In fact, they were doing what we would say, and many would say, states are obliged to do who are signatories of things like the Genocide Convention, and yet they are being treated like terrorists. It's absolutely unbelievable. They're being tried in a court that is normally reserved for terrorists and people involved in organised crime. Their legal team are not allowed to sit beside them. They come in behind a huge glass barrier. they're handcuffed. All these things are unprecedented. We know from the legal representatives of the OM5 and Daniel Tatlow Diwali, these things are completely unprecedented. And the OM5's legal team have called for the judge to recuse themselves. So it's an absolute travesty. And indeed, there have been reports in recent years suggesting that there is significant political interference in the German judicial system, and we seem to be seeing that playing out in this sort of show trial that the OM5 are being subjected to at the moment. And we would reiterate, therefore, our call on the Irish government to send monitors in to the trial to expose the travesty of justice that is going on in relation to the OM5, and for the Taoiseach and the Irish government to make a public statement in support of the OM5 and against what the German government are trying to do to these people who, whatever you may think of what they've done, do not deserve to be treated in this way. They were simply protesting about the horrors they see being visited on the Palestinians.